Jimmy and Tom show again today. This is their third presentation. The first presentation was back in February. Premier Dixon of Dixon was here. Having telling his book about his great-great-great-grandfather, Father John Dixon. Great story. That was followed up by a presentation on the Dixon ferry and a little bit about the stagecoach. We're going to get into that in full here today with Tom's presentation. And then last month, Jim finished up the family story. A lot of personal asides, and that was just a fabulous program. In between, we had a program that was prompted by their talk. The first talk of the Father John Dixon story was mentioned that he had the stagecoach that ran from Galesburg to Galena, hauling lead miners. Well, that prompted an interest in lead mining in Galena. That also prompted the thought that the director of properties in Galena is a good friend of mine who takes care of the General Grant home. So he was here as well, along with a fellow who does impersonations. In fact, he knew more about Grant than Grant's family did, I believe. It's a great show. So here we are today to wrap this up. And before we go on, Roger King, president of the People, is going to give you a little bit of an update on a few things that have been happening here, some of the visitors we've had in. And with that, Roger, I'll turn it over to you.
My dog Sammy's here. He's
My
same
dog
age.
now.
He's the same age as I am in dog years. He is 70 years old, and I will be soon. So he's lost his hearing completely, and he's extremely emotionally attached to me. So he gets lost very easy. So he's probably looking for me right now. So he won't go anywhere. Hey, thanks for coming. This is a great show, Tom. Thanks for showing up and doing all this. This is quite a story. The history of transportation in this country, every facet you turn to, is fascinating. You've all touched it differently. You've all lived it, but it's never boring. And I wish they could have made history this interesting to me. I wish we had a Tom Wadsworth in my classes in high school and so forth, because I'd like to see more of it. And it is truly the most important thing is our past to lead us to the future. Chris, thank you for getting everything done and making your contacts. I don't know what we do without it. The Silverview is slowly but surely being worked on, and we have crew in there working today. The goal at this point in time is to get the dome presentable and done completely by winter. So that's a good place for us to focus. It'll show that progress can happen, because there's a lot of naysayers right now when they walk through, and I get that, but it can be done. So we're going to try and hit the fundraising portion of that sometime this summer. We haven't. We've been lucky enough to operate limitedly with the funds we had secured before, but we need funds, and I need to find somebody that wants to run my campaign for us down here. But if you know of anybody that would like to help with fundraising, I'd love to have their number. So good weather to work on the car. There's going to be landscaping done this year. The parking lot's going to be redone. The back patio is going to happen between the car and the rail, so that continued progress. So we're also going to have a lot of tours this year on the car. There'll be some designated days to come down with Mike Abernathy, and hopefully we can attract people from outside our community that want to have a personalized tour. That some of the people that are coming to see the car, it's accomplishing what we hope will be more relevant later, is when they come to see the car, they come to the Depot Museum, not realizing that it's here. And when they find out they can come in here, people are very receptive and don't realize what a gem this is. And once they're walking in here, they're tied to it. So it's doing what we hope it would do. I think that's the update on things. So thank you all for. Oh, by the way, we got generous donation. We got some. I think. Some great reproductions of Marv Kundi's sketch. We offer these out for donations today, from the small to the medium to whatever you feel. Anybody would like one, the donation jar is back here. Grab one you need and leave an appropriate donation. We appreciate it.
Yeah, Marv was a veteran. In fact, he and Mayor Jim Dixon were in the same class in school. He graduated in 1957 from Dixon, so he's been a friend of the community for quite a few years here in Oregon. Thank you, Roger. With that, I'm going to turn the show over to Tom Wadsworth. He was a minister in Dixon for quite a few years. He served as communication director of Raider Garage Door Company for quite a few years. Now owns his own communication company. You see him all over the place, in the Oregon Depot especially. He hosted a program early this month about the bridge collapse down in Dixon that happened back in 1873. Great presentation. But with that, turn the show over to Tom. Thank you very much for coming today, Tom.
Thank you, Chris. Well, good morning. I need to know, I did, in January, Jim and I both spoke, it's the end of January, and I went through the first 4 or 5 of my 11 revelations. How many were here for that? Okay, it's just a small number, so I'm going to go ahead and run through those again, because if you haven't forgotten, or even if you're here, you may have forgotten them. I think I've forgotten. So it'll be a good refresher for me to see these things as well. So let me tell you what's going on here. I have to thank Jim for giving me the impetus to do this research. Jim, about a year ago, Jim Dixon sent me a copy of his new book called The Dixons of Dixon. And in it, he reveals that Father John Dixon had a stagecoach and a stagecoach line. And it was a big business. And this blew my mind. And I had to know more. And so what I did, it's important to understand my research strategy here. I have been compiling digital copies of county histories throughout northwestern Illinois. I have 3 or 4 of Ogle County histories, all published back in the 1800s to the early 1900s. Lee County history, Carroll County, Joe Davies, Whiteside, etc. It goes all the way around the area. And what I did, since I have digital copies, I can do a quick search. And I search for the word stage or stagecoach every time it's found in all of these histories. And I got at least 20 of them, plus several more records that I went through to find out more about the stagecoach, because I haven't seen anything written about the stagecoach in this area. All my years growing up in Dixon, in this area, I had no idea that there was even a stagecoach in this area. Blew my mind. And one of the reasons why that's the case, I think, is that the Dixon Telegraph, which was the earliest paper throughout this area to be published, came out in 1851. And so we pretty much know everything that took place after 1851, because it was chronicled in the Telegraph and in other newspapers as they popped up. But what happened before 1851? It's this period of history, local history, that a lot of people know nothing about. But it was captured in these old county histories that were published 100, 150 years ago, and that's where all this information is coming from. So, I have gone through my book. I wrote a book on this called I forget what it's called. Maybe it's called Stagecoach from Early Dixon. Maybe that's the name of it. But it's like 132 pages. I put it into a PDF, and you can have a free copy of it if you want. I can email that to you after the show here today. But what I've done is gone through all 132 pages and looked for what were the most mind-blowing moments or revelations that I found in my research. And I have found 11 revelations that I'm here to share with you today. I wish it were 10, it would see so much, or 12 is a much better number, but it's not. I've got 11, so it is what it is. So revelation number 1, as I've already mentioned, was that John Dixon ran a stagecoach line. And let me just run briefly through some of the evidence that indicates this. First off, He wrote a letter in 1830 to the U.S. Secretary of War. John Dixon was upset because he had some horses stolen by the Indians in this area. And in this letter he says, during 18 months previous to January last, so he's talking about 1829, 1828, I was engaged as a subcontractor for carrying the mail from Peoria to Galena. There he just outright admits what he was doing. And not as if there's any shame in it all. He was in the business of carrying the mail. Well, you might say, well, that's not a stagecoach. That's carrying the mail. Well, as the more you get into understanding stagecoaches and carrying the mail, they become the same thing. Because anybody who carried the mail ended up getting a stagecoach, and they would take the mail along with passengers on their designated routes. And this was going on constantly throughout the country at this time. He also says in this same letter, in October of 1829, one of his 15 horses was stolen from Oliver Kellogg's stables, which was one of the nightstands about halfway from Rocky River to Galena. This is John Dixon's own words saying this. So he's got a nightstand midway between Dixon and Galena. And it's where his brother-in-law, Oliver Kellogg, has Kellogg's Grove, and that's where he sets up a whole bunch of horses. And why does he have a bunch of horses midway? Well, because he's got to change out horses. You can't take horses all the way from here to Galena pulling passengers. It'll wear them out. They've got to be refreshed. And so that's why he's got all these horses in these stables up there, and he had one of them stolen. I don't know if you know about Kellogg's Grove, but it's a spot up there in Stevenson County now. It's about midway between here and Galena. This is a photo I took from that spot. There's a historical marker on that spot. Beautiful view from there, by the way, at Kellogg's Grove. It's not a town. There's not even a house. Well, there might be a house really close by, but there's nothing there anymore. But it was also the site of a famous battle in the Black Hawk War. Back then. But that's Kellogg's Grove, and that's where it was. I also ran across a map produced in 1829 of this area. 1829, mind you. They made the map because of all the activity going on in Galena. And it's fascinating to look at this, because all of this was Joe Davies County. No, hold on. He used to running this. See, this is all Joe Davies County. This is the Rock River going up here. Down here, it's got OG's Ferry. And here's another ferry and tavern, which is probably where Prophetstown was. But let's follow the path here. Going up from the south, the Fort Clark Road, or the Peoria to Galena Trail, goes up through here and goes to Kellogg's Tavern, which that's where it is, and then it cuts a left and heads on over to Galena in northwest Illinois, right? That's what this all looked like by then. There was only three houses. There was OG's Ferry and Tavern here in what is now Dixon. Then there was Hardy's Tavern, which I have no idea where that is anymore. It was gone within a couple of years. And then Kellogg's Tavern, then up and over. There's just a couple houses really between here and Galena at that time, and that marks them out. There's another route going up, which is the Lewistown Road. Goes up to the west, parallel somewhat to the Kellogg's Trail, or the Fort Clark Road, and it connects with that road going into Galena. That crosses the Rock River down here at another ferry and tavern, which we now know as Prophetstown, Illinois. And it was also associated with the Indian, the Prophet, the Indian, but I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here on that. But this is what the area looked like in 1829. Before there was an Oregon, before there was a Dixon. That's when OG's Tavern, OG's Ferry was there to help people across the river at that spot. Now, when John Dixon says he carried the mail, it was probably just on a horse to begin with, and some of his original mail bags are at the Loveland Building in Dixon to this day. You can go actually look at them. They've been kept down in the family, and the family's given them to the Loveland Building, so they're still there to this day. But probably as the mail got more increasing volume. He had more than a horse. He probably would get a hack like this, where he would throw the mail in the back of that thing and then take a horse and a wagon. And eventually, this became a mail stage. And here's another piece of the evidence that we have that John Dixon ran a stagecoach. In the Miner's Journal, which was published in 1828 and 1829 in Galena, a little-known little journal just published for the Galena area, for all the miners going on up there. There's an ad in there a number of times where John Dixon has a mail stage which charged people an $8 fare to go from Galena to Peoria, and another $3 to go from Peoria to Springfield, Illinois. The fact that this is a fare, F-A-R-E, he's charging a fare to people, not charging a fare to people to carry mail, because that mail's, he's getting paid to do the mail for the government. So here is already some evidence that he's carrying passengers even prior to 1830. Also, there's another book called Early Times at Dixon's Ferry, which was published at a very early stage that tells some of the earliest stories of this area. John K. Robinson wrote it, who was a friend of John Dixon. He says in early 1828, James P. Dixon drove the mail wagon when the Indians were running the ferry at the Dixon location. So this is another indication that there is the Dixon family is running something of a stagecoach operation early on, even before 1830, which is when he moved to Dixon. In this story about James P. Dixon, John Dixon's son, is running this wagon. He says he were vexed at the delay of the Indians and their arrogance when they did assist him across on the ferry to get across the river. He boldly unchecked his horses so as to give them a chance to swim, and he crossed the river with the mail and wagon in safety. So he's ticked at the Indians because they couldn't be relied on to come over and get him across the river. There's more to that story, but I'll avoid that right now. And in 1830, John Dixon then moves to that river location, which we now know as Dixon, to occupy a more central position for his mail contract. So John Dixon has a mail contract to run the mail from Peoria up to Galena, and he wanted to get in this central position. Plus, OG proved to be unreliable in that location as well, so he basically replaces him and moves to, and has a log cabin there at Dixon famously, and Jim talked about that last time he was here. Another piece of evidence also comes from John K. Robinson. In the winter of 1831, he says, Father Dixon and his stage passengers were so benumbed with cold and nearly frozen as to be unable to get out of the conveyance, the stage. After a good warming and hot coffee, everybody was able to resume their journey. But this reference to John Dixon and his stage passengers is another indication that John Dixon does indeed have a stagecoach line. So this was the first mind-blowing revelation I had, that John Dixon had a stagecoach. News to me, and now news to you, but that's revelation number one. Now, revelation number two that also kind of blew my mind, that stagecoach travel stopped during the Black Hawk War. This just gave me an indication of the power of the Black Hawk War, how much influence it had on what's going on around here. Some of the evidence of this in one of the histories of the area counties, of Bureau County history, it said during the Black Hawk War, every settler within the limits of Bureau County left the country for a place of safety, and the welcome sound of the stage horn was heard no more. The welcome sound of the stage horn. I wonder, well, what's it talking about here? Well, it turns out, as I found out, every time a stagecoach would come into town, the driver would pick up a horn and he would have this particular horn routine, that fanfare that he would blow, and the kids would come running and everybody come running because they got the mail. And people have been waiting for a week or two, maybe 3 weeks for the mail, and finally it's coming. It's kind of like that scene from The Music Man, the Wells Fargo wagon is a-coming, that whole thing, right? It's the same thing. And everybody all get around and watch the wagon come into town, and that's the same kind of thing. And I read about this in all these county histories. Everybody anticipated the arrival of the stagecoach. But during the Black Hawk War, it shuts down. Here's another piece from the Bureau County history. It says, the Great Galena Road to and from the lead mines was now deserted. No traveler would risk his life in passing through a country then thought to be full of hostile savages. And they did. And John Dixon, there's evidence that he also sent his family out, and some stayed also for a while. And then his brother-in-law, Charles Boyd, down at Boyd's Grove, he sent his family, or some of his family, down to Peoria. Oliver Kellogg also sent some of his family up to Galena for safety. But those are the places of safety, Galena and Peoria, during the Black Hawk War. And it was a dangerous place to be. I don't know if any of you have seen this particular historical marker, which is near Polo, Illinois. It's actually in Buffalo Grove. William Durley was killed by the Indians May 19, 1832, near this spot on the Galena Trail. The Galena Trail is where the Stagecoach runs. And there were 2 times that the Stagecoach did run during the entire Black Hawk War, which was several months during 1832. And during one of those times, yes, the Indians ambushed the Stagecoach. Even though it was protected by a squadron of soldiers, still William Durley was killed by Indians at that spot on the Galena Trail. And you can see it here. That place over here in the corner, you can see the road there. That's the Galena Trail Road, which is 1 mile west of Polo, if you ever want to go see that spot. There's actually several different rocks there that all have different little etchings on them about this particular incident. So that was Revelation number 2. I could talk more about that, but that's just enough. The mind-blowing thing is that the Black Hawk War stopped stagecoach travel. Revelation number 3. There was not just a stagecoach, but there was fierce stagecoach competition going on in this area. Who knew? I had no idea. They're actually quite angry with each other on this whole thing. There's 2 key players going on, running stagecoaches in this area. They were Frank Walker of Chicago and John D. Winters of Elizabeth, Illinois. You know, Elizabeth up there close to Galena, you don't know where that is. Well, that's where John D. Winters was. Frank Walker was based out of Chicago. You might ask, well, why didn't I mention John Dixon? Well, it appears that John Dixon was a subcontractor, not a contractor, with the federal government, as he admitted in that 1830 letter. He said, I was a subcontractor to carry mail. John D. Winters subcontracted out a section of the trail to John Dixon, and also James P. Dixon, we have evidence, I think I mentioned this later. James P. Dixon, John Dixon's son, was an agent for the Frank Walker line, going from Dixon to Chicago. So but he's an agent for them. He doesn't own the line at that time. So this is a photo of what the Frank and Walker, see their sign here in the center, Frank Walker and Company, in downtown Chicago, what it looked like back then. And now mind you, in 1832, there's just a handful of people in Chicago. Dixon is bigger than Chicago, I think, at that early stage. But within a matter of months, that wasn't the case any longer. But that lake in Dearborn is where Frank and Walker were located. And it was a big operation, the Frank and Walker operation. James P. Dixon was, according to the history of Lee County in 1881, was for a long time agent for Frank and Walker, and in the latter years of his life was in the livery business. And these 2 businesses go hand in hand, the livery business and the stagecoach business, because you got to have horses, a whole bunch of horses, not just 4 to carry your stagecoach here, but you got to have these stables, as I pointed out earlier, and then you got to take care of the horses. You got to get them shoed, you got to replace the shoes, you got to give them food and rest and water and barn, and all that stuff is required. But this is what a livery is, and that's what James P. Dixon was doing at the same time that he was an agent for Frank and Walker, and he also, by the way, became the postmaster in Dixon, as his father had been before him. But all these activities go together. Running the mail, running a stagecoach, running the livery, and being the postmaster to deliver the mail. You're actually not delivering it. People come to you back then, and they come to your window, and you go, I need my mail today, Jim, and then they get their mail that way. And here's another map that shows you the main routes of Frank and Walker at this time. This, of course, Chicago way over here on the right? There's this middle route developed in 1834 that comes to Dixon, then shoots up through up to Galena. Elizabeth is here where John D. Winters is. And this is a town here called Midway. We know it as Rockford. Is it the Midway Village in Rockford? Well, first, Rockford was called Midway. And why was it called Midway? Because it's midway between Chicago and Galena, because everybody is still going to Galena back then. The appeal of the lead mines stays really solid through the area through the 1820s and 1830s, and even beyond that as well. And then there's this other route going down here from Chicago down to Ottawa, and then over to Peru, and then shooting on down to Peoria. And there's also a line going over to Rock Island. But Frink and Walker has stagecoach lines going on all these areas and more. It becomes a huge business, which we'll talk about here in a minute. In 1840, Frink and Walker dropped their fare going from Chicago to Rockford to only $5. John D. Winters, though, was charging $8 for Rockford to Galena. Now, the point here is that there's a fare war going on. And Frink and Walker, being the bigger operation, had the ability to cut their fares lower to force John D. Winters out of business, which eventually does happen. In a letter that E.B. Washburn wrote to John Dixon in 1874, E.B. Washburn, by the way, really cool guy back there in the 1830s and 40s. He's going from Galena down to Springfield frequently to the state capitol. He's a lawyer, and he has business between those two, and he talks about his experiences on the stagecoach going through there. And he openly condemned, or Winters openly condemned Frink's company as damn Yankees because of their New England roots. John Frink came from Massachusetts and Connecticut. Winters considered Frink's extensions into northwestern Illinois as an invasion by the Yankees. This is the trash talk going on at this time. Winters also became furious, and a stage war was inaugurated, which raged with a terrible violence. This is also in that letter from E.B. Washburn, who later, by the way, became the Secretary of State of the United States and an ambassador to France. He was buddies with Abraham Lincoln and with John Dixon and a lot of other people. So he was a very, very influential guy. But he is the one who testifies to this particular fact of the stage war going on. The competition, he says, resulted in a violent personal assault by Winters, who attacked John Frink in the barroom of the Old American House of Galena. It doesn't get any better than this. This is the old barroom brawls that you see in these saloons in the old westerns. And they get your guns out and take it outside right now, boys. But there's a fight going on between these two owners of the two main stage lines in this area. Fascinating stuff. So they really hated each other. But in the end, Frink wins. He owns 160 horses just for Chicago to Peru alone, plus a whole bunch more going south from there. He spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., currying the favor of politicians. Why would he do that? Well, the key thing that keeps these stagecoach lines alive is mail contract. You get the mail contract, then you have to be running the mail. And if you're going to run the mail, you might as well take people with you and make a whole lot more. And these fares, when I talk about $5 or $8 or $11, that's big money back then. That's like a month's wages for some of these people. That's how much it would cost in order to just take a stagecoach, which is an awful ride, awful, going from Chicago to Dixon or wherever you're going. He basically created a monopoly. John Frink did, in Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, Michigan, Indiana. This guy owns the business. And he's got all the politicians in his pocket. Who knows what kind of favors are being exchanged under the table. But eventually John D. Winters says, I'm out. And he packs up in 1848 and leaves town. Now this comes to Revelation number 4. This one blew my mind. That essentially, John Winters, after he leaves, becomes Ben Cartwright. Now, he doesn't literally become a guy named Ben Cartwright. And you know what we're talking about? The Bonanza? You all watched the show back in the 60s, great show. But, so what's the evidence for this, Wadsworth? Well, we know that in 1848, Winters sold all his stuff, and maybe kept some of his horses and such, and he goes west to California. Now, 1848 is an ideal time to go to California, because what happens in 1849? The gold rush! The 49ers, right? And so John D. Winters is out there. He forms a company called Winters Express, where he's basically transporting freight for miners. And he's got miners also he's taken with them. And he's listened to their rumors about where the strike might be over here, there, or wherever. And he ends up buying a 1/18th share of what was called the Ophir mine, which was part of the Comstock lode that eventually generated, are you ready? Millions of tons of gold and silver ore. I didn't say millions of dollars. I said millions of tons of gold and silver ore. And he became very wealthy and prominent in California and Nevada. He even had one of his sons had a city named after him in Winters, California. It's between Sacramento and Napa, California. I almost went right by there a couple of years ago. I put this in my book. Mark Twain. You all heard Mark Twain, right? Well, he makes this famous statement that in something about 1/18th share of the Ophir mine was enough to make John D. Winters extremely wealthy. I forget exactly how that statement goes. But Mark Twain knew how just having a 1/18th share of this mine made John Winters extremely wealthy beyond our imagination. This is a photo, of course, of, there they are. Now, his name is Ben. The actor's name is Lauren Green, right? There's Hoss. His name is
Dan Blocker.
Dan Walker?
Blocker.
Blocker, that's it, thank you. There's Little Joe. Michael Landon, yes, your favorite. And Pernell Roberts, well done. Big brother named Adam. Yeah, there they are. Well, the similarities between the Winters family and the Cartwright family are remarkable. Both had 3 sons. Ben Cartwright had 3 and John D. Winters had 3. Both became extremely wealthy in mining. And the show Bonanza was filmed on John D. Winters' land, which they called in the show the Ponderosa. And there's a posting, this is still all kind of circumstantial, I get it, but there's a post on a website that talks about this, where the great-great-great-grandson of John D. Winters said, yes, I am the great-great-great-grandson of John D. Winters, and it's always been understood by our family that, yes, the Bonanza TV show was based on the Winters family. So it's still somewhat circumstantial, but a little bit more solid than you get family members saying, yeah, the Cartwrights are the same as the Winters. So that's pretty interesting. Even though John D. Winters was one feisty character, he got in that barroom brawl, in Galena, but he becomes extremely wealthy after all this. One of his sons runs for governor of Nevada even. It's a big story. Anyway, that was Revelation number 4. Blew my mind. On to Revelation number 5. In some ways, this is the biggest one of all. I've got 11 to go, so. Dixon becomes the great stagecoach transfer station. Notice that phrase is in quotes. When I ran across this quote in one of the county histories, I thought, whoa! I never would have thought of Dixon being the great stagecoach transfer station. But let's look at what's going on in Dixon in 1837. There are only 10 to 12 families living in Dixon at that time. Now that probably parlayed to maybe, let's say each family has a total of 3 people on average. We're still talking 40 people. It's not a very big town. And John Dixon's cabin becomes a tavern, which is, a tavern is not a bar like we would refer to it today, but back then a tavern would have been a hotel. But a really, really rustic hotel and very small. but that's what it was. People could stay there. But in 1837, there are 3 hotels in Dixon. There's Dixon's Tavern, the Western Hotel, which started in December of 1836, and the Rock River House, which started in 1837. What in the world is a town of 40 people doing having 3 hotels? I mean, Dixon today has 2, I don't know, and they're about to have another one, I guess, pretty soon. One of the Hilton hotels is coming to town, I forget what it is, Jim. But this is bizarre that at this early stage, so many hotels are in Dixon. Why is this the case? Well, the answer is the ferry is the answer as to why it becomes such a popular thing. The evidence on this is interesting. In the history of Dixon and Meyer, published in 1880, they would talk about Father Dixon. And it said it was a no unusual thing when the circumstances of travelers were told to Father Dixon for him to allow his ferry and hotel bills to remain unpaid. So he's not just running a stagecoach, but he's also running a ferry, and he's also running a hotel. And there's a book about John Dixon's account books, and it shows all this stuff, and he would let people just get by without paying him. He was that nice of a guy who was beloved by everybody in northwestern Illinois and beyond there for these reasons and more. His unselfishness manifested itself in goodwill to all men. The Indian, the child, they all looked to him for favors and kindness and was not turned away empty. Another quote from the 1880 history here. From 1829 to 1835, this same history book says 5 to 20 teams a day would utilize Dixon's Ferry every spring and fall. Teams, we're talking about like a team of horses or cattle or something, and they all need to get across. They're heading up to Galena, or they're heading down to Peoria. They got to get something to get across the river. So they got a ferry. But there's this big backlog that develops at Dixon because this ferry doesn't go fast, and especially if you've got a 20 head of cattle to get across, and the ferry only cattle to carry 3 at a time or something, plus the people you've got and whatever wagons you may have, you're going to be waiting in line. And if you're waiting in line, you're going to be spending the night. And if you're spending the night, you need a hotel. That's why Dixon becomes a great stagecoach transfer station in northwestern Illinois. There's more evidence on this that actually comes from Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who spent time here in 1831 and 1832 during the Black Hawk War. Lieutenant Jefferson Davis came to Dixon's Ferry at that time, and he, quote, found the mail coach and numbers of wagons with persons going to the lead mines detained at the river. There's one citation from one of these histories that says as many as 200 people were backlogged waiting to get across the river at Dixon. And so where would they stay but at Dixon? This is, by the way, in Jefferson Davis's memoir written by his wife, Farina Davis, in 1890, but she kept detailed notes about his life from earlier on when he was in Dixon. Here's an actual clipping from one of the books that talks about this. It says, at this time, Dixon was an important station on the stage route from Peoria to Galena. Other lines centered here from different parts of the state, connecting with the main line to Galena. The Chicago, Ottawa, Peoria lines. This gave Dixon a prominence in connection with the traveling public, and to meet the public demand, 2 hotels were erected in Dixon in 1836 and 1837. The first was the Western, the second was the Rock River House, and already they had the Dixon's Tavern there. Another one goes up in the next year as well. It's amazing. Now, when we're talking about hotels, we're not talking about 4-story structures with 200 rooms. We're talking about maybe half a dozen, maybe a dozen rooms, I'm not sure, but not that many. You may know about the Nachusa House in Dixon, which still stands to this day by the Dixon Arch. That started construction in 1837 or 8, but I think the financial problems of the nation delayed that project. Didn't get finished until 1853, but that was a hotel that also went in initially to take care of the stagecoach traffic. And it still does handle stagecoach traffic when it finally gets up in 1853. But as this history says, the hotels of a place take considerable prominence in the mind of the traveling public and in forming an opinion of a town. And they'll say, yeah, Dixon's a great place to stay. There's several hotels you can choose from, and so plan on spending the night there in Dixon. There's also this book published in 1838, which is remarkable in itself. And the name of the book is Illinois in 1837 and 8. And it makes this statement about Dixon. In Dixon, the stage roads from Chicago by Napiersville, Naperville, from Ottawa by Troy Grove, and from Peoria by Windsor and Princeton, all concentrate and pass on to Galena. So everybody knew, and even in 1837 and 8, that Dixon is this place where all these roads concentrate. And thus making this statement that Dixon was the great transfer station on the stage lines that traversed the country. One of the reasons why you would have hotels there is not just because of the river slowing down traffic and not just because of the ferry, but Dixon is also in this unique position. A stagecoach typically went no more than 80 to 90 miles per day. And if you're coming from Chicago and heading to Galena, you're going to stop. And Dixon becomes a perfect spot. Or if you're leaving from Naperville or Napiersville, Joseph Napier was the guy who founded that. He was also known as Napier early on in his life. But that's a perfect distance. Also from Ottawa to Dixon is about 1 day's ride on Stagecoach. From Peru to Dixon, one day's ride. So you got to stop. And you're stopping there at Dixon. Rock Island to Dixon. Galena to Dixon, 1 day's ride. And so you're stopping there at Dixon. That's why it becomes this great transfer station for all these hotels. And that's amazing. Now, I found another piece that had to deal with Oregon history, and I had to slide it in somewhere, so I put it in here. You remember this building? Yeah. This is the Mississippi Hotel. It was established in 1849. There is the Oregon Depot Museum on its website for this place. Has this statement. It says the cupola on top of the building was useful to lookouts. What were they doing? Watching for approaching stagecoaches. And there it is. This is right there at the main intersection downtown. You know where it is. But they could get up there, and they'd be probably looking across the river for them coming from Chicago, because yes, the stagecoach did come to Oregon as well, and Oregon became something of a hub as well, but not at this early stage like Dixon was. But later on, it's getting stagecoaches coming up from Dixon, coming down from Rockford, coming from Chicago, which is actually a better route to go from Chicago to Oregon instead of going through Dixon, which is too far south if you're going to go up to Galena afterward. But anyway, it's a great place, and so the stagecoach is a significant thing around here too. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But here's the Dixon hub. I talked about it being 1 day's ride in from all these different locations. That's why Dixon was the great transfer station for the stagecoach in northwestern Illinois. That was revelation number 5. Blew my mind. Now here's another one. Revelation number 6. This one changed my outlook of the entire world. I don't think I'm exaggerating. Listen to this. And this revelation could be summarized as the significance of stagecoaches and the 10 to 15 mile interval. What am I talking about here? Well, here's some of the evidence. In the history of Lee County in 1914, the statement is made there that Frink and Walker wanted their coaches to make no more than 12 miles at a time before they had to stop. Why did they stop? Because of this guy, the horse. A horse is a horse, of course, and it's got to stop, and it's got to get fed, and it's got to get watered, and it needs rest. I mean, if you've been pulling a wagon of 3,000 pounds for 12 miles, you're going to need a rest too. And people back then, they took care of their horses. They knew that they needed to do this. You can't just be running them till they're bloody and dying. So that's what's going on with this 10 to 15 mile interval. And what that meant is that every 10 to 15 miles there needed to be a stage station. And when a stage station would develop, that station would soon develop into a town. And think about all the towns around here and how they're just about 10 to 15 miles apart. let's talk about a Lee County example. Dixon's Ferry is up here. You gotta go 13 miles before you get to the first stage station, which was at Inlet Grove in Bliss's Tavern. And then from there, Malugan's Grove is established 10 miles beyond that. This happened because Zachariah Malugan, who was a friend of John Dixon, he's hanging out in Dixon's Ferry in 1832. I think he fought in the Black Hawk War at that time, but he's hanging out there, and he goes to John Dixon and says, "John, I'm looking for someplace to live, something to do. You got any ideas?" And John Dixon says, "Yes, I happen to know. Captain Joseph Napier is surveying this area. He's going to build a stage route going from Dixon to Chicago. And the plan is to open it on January the 1st of 1834. And we're going to need stage stations every 10 to 15 miles. And as I already know that Adolphus Bliss has got a stage tavern right here in Inlet Grove he's going to have, but we're going to need one another 10 miles beyond that spot." And Zachariah says, "Say no more." And so Zachariah actually gets on the first stage on January 1st of 1834, heading out of Dixon, and he stops at Inlet Grove like they had to do, because there was a stables there, there's a barn, there's horses, they refresh the horses, they get new horses on, and off they go, and they find a grove, and Zachariah says, "Stop right here," and then he gets off the stage, and he eventually builds a stage station, and on it goes. Now, if you look at this, the remarkable 10 to 15 mile ratio, Dixon is 13 miles from Inlet Grove. It's 10 miles from Buffalo Grove in Ogle County. It's 11 miles from Sterling, 19 miles to Dad Joe Grove. Now, you probably haven't heard of Dad Joe Grove, but this going straight south out of Dixon. This is the first stage station out of Dixon going south. But it's 19 miles. It's a longer trek to get there. Grand Detour is only 5, but to Oregon from Dixon, or from Grand Detour, 10 miles. Go to Oregon to Byron, 10 miles. Kellogg's Grove is 3 times 12 miles. So you've got 3 intervals, get 2 stops before you get to Kellogg's Grove, and you see all, just do the math. Do the math. And it figures out, towns aren't like 3 miles apart from each other here. Sometimes you'll see a 5-mile difference like Dixon to Grand Detour, but there, Grand Detour is there because the river, and you got to get a ferry to get across, and so you're going to slow people down. You're going to need to have something going on there. But this 10 to 15 mile ratio is remarkable. And then, just on a lark, I was reading about Roman roads in ancient Rome. And there's a Wikipedia article on this, and this is what it says. Every 10 miles or so, Roman roads had changing stations for the horses and a small tavern for food and lodging. They're talking about the 1st century. It turns out that transportation hasn't changed in 2,000 years. They're doing the same thing in the 1800s here in Illinois and everywhere else for that matter. You got to have these stations every 10 miles. Why? Because of the horses. So, mind-blowing revelation. How about that? Isn't that something? Now, here's another one. Another thing. Revelation number 7. Why did they settle in groves? You got Boyd's Grove, then going up to Dad Joe Grove on the Peoria to Galena station, then goes up to Dixon. It's not a grove, it's because it's got a river there. Then you go up to Buffalo Grove, then on up to Kellogg's Grove, and you got Inlet Grove, you're going east, then you got Malugan's Grove, and then you got Pawpaw. What in the world is going on with all these groves? Why were they settling in groves? And
Water, trees, grass.
you got the idea. There's more to it, but thank you. You're spoiling it for me.
Sorry.
That's fine. But there's this historical marker in Pawpaw about the old Chicago Trail, and it has a quote there from Margaret Fuller, the poetess, who says, our stage stations were not from town to town, but from grove to grove.
How pleasant.
Interesting. Why is that? And here's, I showed you the Inlet Grove, Mulligan's Grove, Pawpaw Grove, you got all that. And then this is a map of Ogle County, okay? And this map was put together by Russell Poole. How many of you heard of Russell Poole before? This guy is a legend in Ogle County. You need to know about Russell Poole. This guy did a massive amount of work back in the 1950s and 60s, writing these maps, locating all these intricate details all along the way, mostly related to these stagecoach trails, and also some of the groves and some of the mines and some of all these other different landmarks throughout the entire area. Every place you see on this map, one of these little red triangles, this is a place where there was a stage stop in Ogle County. This is Oregon in the center. You go Mount Morris, you got up here to a place called West Grove, and all around here. There's, I forget, there's got to be close to 20 of them there, but they're all over the place. Now, of course, when the stagecoach started, there's maybe one in Ogle County, but as time goes on, and as more people start populating the area in the later 1830s and certainly in the 1840s and definitely 1850s, you're going to need more stage stops because more people are there, more towns are starting to get established, and the mail's got to get there. That's why the stagecoach goes there through all this thing. I took one of Russell Moore's maps of Ogle County and plotted all the places where there is a named grove. And every place you see a green tree here on this map is where there is a named grove in Ogle County. And here's another, just a list of all the Ogle County groves. There's 19 of them throughout the area. And which ones, you probably are familiar with a lot of these. Which ones sound familiar? I'm curious, what?
Buffalo.
Buffalo Grove, of course.
Washington Grove.
Washington Grove, good.
Brody's Grove.
Brody's Grove.
White Rock.
White Rock, yes. Campbell's Grove. Maybe, anyway, and they're out there, and they're still there to this day. Some of the names have sort of gone away. But all these people, all these places is where people settled back then. And here's some of the evidence on this. In the history of Carroll County, it said it was then believed people could not live through the winters in the open prairies. You couldn't live. You're not going to sell out there in the open prairie. What are you, nuts? You'll freeze your butt off out there or something. And then you couldn't do that. There's more evidence here. Then there's this interesting quote from a Pawpaw history in the Lee County history. It says, Jacob Rogers of Pawpaw was the first to settle out there in the prairie west of the grove, and he was ridiculed for it. Rogers, what are you, nuts being out there? You're out there in the prairie? You're going to die. Well, why did people settle in groves? You guys already hit on several of these. You got shelter in winter. The snow's not going to be so bad if you're surrounded by trees. You got shade in the summer when it's getting really hot. You got wood for fire, construction of homes, fences, tables, furniture. There's wildlife hunting, of course, in there. You got squirrels and deer running through the trees. Syrup in some of the trees, fruit, nuts. There's rich soil for planting right around there as well. And back there, they're not planting, 100 acres. They just can't do that. So it's just a small area is all they need. They just need some good rich soil, and there's usually a source of water near all these locations where these groves are located. And then one key thing about why they settled in groves blew my mind, didn't realize this, was this quote that I found in the history of Lee County. Every fall, magnificent prairie fires prevailed. The flames at night lit up the sky, enabling a person to read by the light of the fires miles away and being visible for nearly 100 miles. So, when we look out there on the prairie, all we see is cornfields today. But all they saw back then was prairie grass. And in around October of every year, the prairie grass would start to die and get very dry. And one strike by lightning and it would just go throughout the entire area. And I found a few different quotes in these early histories that talk about these prairie fires that you could see for miles and miles and miles. So you don't want to have your house out there in a prairie is in the fall when everything's dying and then the prairie fires go. So you settle in the groves. You got a better chance of stopping the fire before it gets to your cabin in the grove. Make sense? I didn't know this stuff. Maybe you knew that already, but this was a mind-blowing thing for me. That's Revelation number 7. Now, I'm going to touch on Revelation number 8. How many of you live or have lived in Dixon before? Come on, Jim. Jim Dixon. I know Jim Dixon was there. And you have. And I know you worked there, I know. So this, I'll just tread lightly on this particular one. This was very interesting to me. And this is a guess on my part. But I think that Dixon streets were named for the stage routes that went through the area. Now this is a map going like from 1890 or something in Dixon, and it shows the main area. The first plotted area of Dixon goes from Peoria Avenue over to Ottawa, and this is the Glen Avenue Bridge, and it's just really a 3-block area, or just this area, up to 3rd Street to the river, and from Peoria over to Ottawa. This area right here is all there is to Dixon in the early 1830s, like 1835 when the original plat was done. But already at that point, there's Galena Street. It's now called Galena Avenue. Why would they call it Galena Street? It goes to Galena. Then there was Peoria Street. Why would they call it Peoria? It goes to Peoria, right by Jim Dixon's house. No, today. Then there's Ottawa Street. Why would they call it Ottawa Street? It goes to Ottawa, and it really does. And then there's Chicago Road back here that connected to the end of Ottawa Street, and the Chicago Road goes to. And then there's Grady Tour Road, and there's Stagecoach that went to Dixon to Grady Tour. It goes to Grady Tour, and then there's one more. We're not done. The Rock Island Road. Now I have no evidence to prove that all of the Dixon streets were named for these stage routes, but I find the conclusion to be irrepressible. And so, anyway, one more footnote. This is mostly just for Jim's benefit here. Some time ago, the Peoria to Galena Trail Association put up signs all the way from Galena down to Peoria of where the Galena to Peoria Stagecoach Trail goes. And they have signs all along the way, from way up there in Galena to way down there in Peoria, showing where it went. But when it comes through Dixon, it inexplicably comes up Hennepin, and it turns here on 1st Street and goes way out of town to Lincoln, which then turns left up to Pump Factory Road, and travels 17 miles south of town on Pump Factory Road, which wasn't even there back then. And then they're calling that the Peoria to Galena Trail. No. Peoria is because John Dixon's cabin's right there at first in Peoria. They stopped there because that was this postmaster, that was the post office. And back then, you could take Peoria straight all the way out, but in 1855 you can't because they built the railroad across there, and it blocks Peoria Street. Then they make it merge with Galena as it does today. So that's my explanation, and I'm sticking to it. So Revelation number 9 now. Now we get into the really cool stuff. Bandits attacked the Dixon Stagecoach. Oh, this is great stuff. There's controversy. There's evil people. There's thefts going on. And yes, this was going on in Dixon and in this whole area. This is a photo, or actually a photo, it's a drawing, a painting, beautiful painting of a stagecoach activity out west. But this would show some of the key stuff. This is the driver here at the reins, and this guy is holding a gun, and he's riding. That's right. And he's getting the mail here, which seems to be protected. What was going on also back then is that Dixon in 1840 became the land office. John Dixon was successful. He went to Washington, D.C., and he met with President Van Buren. I got this right, Jim? He got a meeting with President Van Buren because of his good buddy, General
Zachary Taylor and who's the other guy from the Mexican War?
and the other guy, yes.
The other guy.
Yeah, we all know his name.
Taylor.
I can't-
Zachary Taylor and I forget.
Big Civil War general.
No,
And
they were both the generals from the from the Mexican-American War. The one came from the north going south, and the other landed off the Caribbean and went up to Mexico City.
Old Fuss and Feathers was his nickname.
Yes.
General Winfield Scott.
Winfield Scott.
Oh, it's
Thank you very much.
And
I can sleep
there were
tonight.
no legislative hearings. There was nothing.
Yes.
He just met those two guys, and they were his friends. They hunted and fished together at Dixon during the
Black Hawk
Black
War.
Hawk War. And they said, "Come on over. We're going to go see the president." And the president signed a piece of paper and transferred it. And the people in Galena were surprised.
They blindsided
Boom.
because they moved the land office from Galena down to Dixon. But it did make sense. Why? Because the land office, you needed to have a land office, because if you wanted to buy any kind of property anywhere, you had to go to the land office, plunk down your money. But to go all the way up to the corner of the state, even to buy land around here, didn't make sense. So Dixon was a more central location for this entire territory, and it made sense. Plus, it made good sense because they were good buddies with John Dixon at the time. Or he was good buddies with the president, or with Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor and all these guys. So, but how this plays into the bandits, all the money goes to the land office. But the land office is not a bank. It's not a secure location. I'm sure they had some security built in, but eventually that money's got to go to a real bank, either down in St. Louis or in Chicago. And how does it get there? There it is. There it is. And that's why you have a guy riding shotgun, because they have to protect this strong box with all the money that they had at the land office. Well, all this is also detailed in a book written in 1850 by Edward Bonney, called The Banditti of the Prairies. How many of you heard of the Banditti of the Prairies? You've heard of this, right? This is a great story. By the way, just a couple years ago, two people produced some videos, and they've been put on YouTube about the banditti in Ogle County area. They're really well done. You got to see them. Just go to YouTube, look for Banditti of the Prairies, and you'll find it. It's fascinating. They last like for 30 minutes or an hour. It's great listening. But Edward Bonney was one of the bandits. And he turned state's evidence against these guys and wrote this book in 1850 about all the things they were doing around Dixon and in Ogle County and up and down the Mississippi. And this is Banditti of the Prairies, or The Murderer's Doom, a tale of the Mississippi Valley. And this book became quite popular throughout the country. And he says in that book, a plan had long been on foot to rob the Dixon land office. Now, robbing the land office is one thing, but what they would really try to do, the Stagecoach is the most vulnerable part of that thing. And the guy who is who's running the stage off of the land office in Dixon at that time is this guy, Colonel John DeMent, who had distinguished himself in the Black Hawk War, and he also settled in Dixon. He became very well known in Dixon, highly revered, great guy. But he's in charge of the land office. And one day, one of the guys who were the banditti, but there's so many of them you don't know who they are. They're undercover. Like in a room like this back in 1840, a third of this group might have been associated with the bandits. I'm assuming it's the people in the back here today. Oh, those Craig Carpenter guys. No, yeah. But they were everywhere, and they're all connected. And you didn't always know who they were. Well, one of these days, one of these bandits goes into the land office, and he's chatting up Colonel John DeMent. Hey, John, how you doing? Yeah, how about them Bears? Or whatever. And he says, so when's the next Stagecoach run with all your money to Chicago going? And Colonel DeMent is no stupid idiot. he smells what's going on. And he says, yeah, well, we're gonna next Wednesday, a week from Wednesday, we'll be taking her in just like usual. And the guy says, thanks a lot, I'll talk to you later. Have a good one. And off he goes. Well, he goes back to his bandits and they plot to intercept the stagecoach going out of Dixon. And sure enough, they do. Let me go to this next statement on the slide. I forget how I've got the order of this. William Cullen Bryant, well-known writer and poet from back then, he writes about his excursion to Rock River in 1841. He makes this statement: the thinly settled portions of Illinois are much exposed to the depredations of horse thieves. In Ogle County, they have a justice of the peace and a constable among their own associates. Ooh. So some of these bad guys are connected with the elected officials. And they became to be known as Bliss, Dewey, and West and Company. Bliss was Adolphus Bliss, who ran the stage station at Inlet Grove. Dewey was the judge, and if Judge Dewey issued a writ against a member of the gang, Constable West was never able to find the offender. Because they're all in on it. When you've got a judge who's a bad guy, and you get the only cop in the area who's a bad guy, and the theory is that Adolphus Bliss at the stage station, he'd have all people coming through the area. Anybody who's new in town would come in, and he'd be listening to their talk, and he'd talk them up. And if they had a bunch of money or they had whatever wealth of some kind, he would learn about it, and he'd pass this along to West, and pass it along to his other associates, and they'd break in and steal all the guy's money. And then eventually when Constable West would go after, oh, he's gone, he's off in Iowa, now we can't find him. And if they actually did make it to court, Judge Dewey would let him free anyway. So that was that bad. And that's how this stagecoach got robbed. And here's the story. I guess I don't have a slide on this. So the land office, the stagecoach comes to the land office in Dixon, gets the strong box, and it leaves actually a week earlier than what Colonel Dement said, and it makes it safely to Chicago. But then on the week later, when John Dement told the guy it was going to run, the guys are up 3 miles short of Rockford. It's going up through Oregon and Byron, going up to Rockford, and they're waiting behind some trees. And actually, in this particular robbery, they sneak behind the stagecoach as it's clumping along, and everybody's looking. The stage driver is looking forward, and the guy with the gun, he's looking forward. They come up behind it. They climb up on the stagecoach. They grab all the luggage, toss it off the back, and all the luggage is found later, strewn all over everywhere. All the people lost their luggage, and there's no money anywhere in the whole stagecoach because John Dement, he foiled the evil plans of the bad guys. So, but all that story is all documented in all these history books. So that's Revelation number 9. I've already gone an hour. My goodness, we got two more. First one, Revelation number 10. It talks about the accuracy of the 1842 painting. Several years ago, I was in the basement of the Dixon Library, and there was a filing cabinet, and I was in the bottom drawer, and I pulled it out, had a bunch of local history, and I saw this photocopy of a painting, and it was this painting of Dixon in 1842. I had never seen anything like this. It's the earliest known depiction of what Dixon would have looked like in 1842. Blew my mind, and I shared this on Facebook, and some of the historians at the Historical Society scoffed at, oh, you can't trust that stuff, it's not accurate at all, he's just throwing houses up there. Well, the more I've hung on to this painting and studied it, and studied local history, I found out there's several details in this painting which are uncannily accurate. For example, so you can see the ferry going across the river. And yes, in 1842, there was a rope ferry. There's the ferry right there. The rope goes stretching across the river to the north side. And some other details. There's Fort Dixon, which was just a little building back then. It wasn't torn down until 1843 or 5, I think. So it's still there in 1842. And sure enough, there it is on the north side of the river. Lord's Hill going to Gap Grove. Gap Grove was definitely in existence in 1842. Then you've got this bluff, which is still there to this day. The National Guard Armory is built right in front of that thing. The route around the fort. This is really crazy. Hope I don't take any things out here. This route along the fort, look at this. This is zooming in a little closer. This is the ferry coming across the river. One of the history books tells about when you got off the ferry, you immediately turned left along the riverbank and went in front of Fort Dixon. This kind of doesn't make sense. Why don't you just keep going? But it says you do this, and then you curl around and go past the fort, and then you can turn and go this way up to Buffalo Grove, or go this way and go to Gap Grove. And this is exactly the way this pathway goes in this 1842 painting. Oh, it's amazing. Now that's not all. The thing that really got me, I kept reading in a couple of the local histories that James P. Dixon had a lean-to when he was the postmaster of Dixon at the corner of First and Ottawa. And had a lean-to. He had a lean-to? Who would have a lean-to? So I look closer at this painting. There's a lean-to in the painting. Oh, what in the world? And it's right where it should be, at First and Ottawa, probably where First and Ottawa should have been. Blew my mind, right? So this was all this stuff, and I could probably go into some details on this, but that really blew my mind. As this statement in the history says, James P. Dixon's house was about 16 feet square, with a small lean-to built against the east side of the house, used as the village post office, where Mr. John Dixon distributed his mail, the mail to his neighbors. So going back to this thing, people come up to these two windows, say, "Hey John, come to get the mail for the McGillicuddies." "Yeah, we got it for you." Then away they would go. But the painting's accurate. 1842 blew my mind. I thought that was pretty cool. This photo is now in possession of a museum in Chicago, but the Dixon Historical Society has gotten a copy of it, a digital copy, and they've had it framed. It stands in the Historical Society. That was Revelation number 10, and now I'm almost done. I'm glad you're still awake, because I'm shocked. And Revelation number 11, which is perfect to end with this one here at the Oregon Depot Museum, because I learned that it was the railroad that killed the stagecoach. Yes. And it all kind of makes sense once I started to learn this. There was a speech at the Illinois State Fair in 1853 by Professor J.B. Turner, who said, "Stagecoaches are all out of date, quite behind the times. Even the comets will scarce come round to visit us without a locomotive in the future." Because back then everybody knew that the train was the future and the past was the stagecoach. And I could find quotes like this all over the country. People knew this was happening, and it was coming to northern Illinois as well. The stagecoach was going to die, and it was going to be replaced by the railroad. And it was. One guy who knew it as well was John Frink, the guy who has this massive monopoly in 7 states of stagecoach lines, right? Well, he sold his business in 1854. It's 1855 when the railroad comes to Dixon. In 1854, he sells it. He becomes a huge stockholder in a railroad, his competition. And as this was in the Chicago Tribune, it says that John Frink probably has been more heartily cursed by weary and impatient travelers than any other man between the Atlantic and the Pacific. They hated this guy. He was actually a very good businessman, but people hated riding in the stagecoach. And he died of paralysis, whatever that means, in May of 1858, just a couple of years later. But he saw the writing on the wall, and he gets out of the stagecoach business, invests heavily in the railroad, so he set even after the railroad done. The Illinois Central Railroad is the big thing. Everybody's been talking about this since the 1830s. It finally gets built and comes up right through Dixon. There's the South Dixon Station and the North Dixon Station of the Illinois Central, which is by Oliver's Jack and Jill today, Jim. And then it goes on up. Oregon is being bypassed here at this early stage in 1855. There's another route of the Illinois Central going directly from Chicago over to Galena. Pretty much they're following the stage trails, and that was stated. There's some places where they avoided the stage trails, which ended up killing stage stations. because they no longer had travel coming through there, and these towns pretty much withered and died after that point. But the Illinois Central Railroad goes all the way down south to Cairo, Illinois, to the very southernmost point. There's another railroad that comes in, also in 1855, in the Chicago and Galena Chicago Union Railroad, coming from east to west. Here's Dixon again, here's Oregon City, as it was called back then. At this time, this is a map from 1863, but it's 1855 when the Illinois Central and the Galena Chicago Union converge on Dixon at that point, and they build the railroad bridge across the Rock River, which is the key deal for the railroad, and on it goes on up to Freeport and on to Galena from there. So the railroad ended up killing the stagecoach. Here's an actual photo that I found of the first railroad bridge at Dixon. It was made out of wood in 1855. I'd never seen this before, Jim, but when I found this, I thought that was pretty cool. It was published in the Telegraph. But it was soon replaced. It looks, you're gonna ride a train on top of these 2x4s? Go, what the heck? And it was replaced in 1862 with a much nicer looking bridge. Looks more secure. It never did collapse, and they got it replaced pretty quickly. And here comes the train across at Dixon, by the way. That's the south side of Dixon on the other side of there. I was at the Chicago History Museum last year, and they have the 1848 Pioneer locomotive, which was Chicago's first locomotive, that's still on display there at that museum, and I took a photo of it here. But that very Pioneer train also, if memory serves, also came right through this area. Probably was not on this particular rail line. This was built later. But then I learned also, just to share one more interesting tidbit, salacious information, which is always the best. There was a railroad accident that took place on April the 22nd of 1855. Now, it was January 55 when the railroad opens up at Dixon, and the railroad comes through. And so everybody's excited. One thing that the Illinois Central did, they said, anybody in town, you want a free ride to Galena, you can hop on Monday at 10 in the morning, and we'll have you back by 6 o'clock at night. And so they gave a free ride to people, and all the citizens came out, hopped on the train, off. So it was great marketing on their part, right? They're going to go anyway. So, but then it gets going, and that's in January. Then in April comes this accident, April the 22nd, involving 6 Irishmen from Polo were on a handcar. This is all from a Dixon Telegraph article. But they're the ones who identified them as Irishmen. So it is what it is. So the 6 Irish, and they purchase a keg of whiskey in Dixon, and they're on a handcar, you know, like doing this to get down the rail line to get down to Dixon. And they got a keg of whiskey, and they drink in Dixon until all reason was destroyed, and they were insensible to all danger. Well, they get back on the rail car. Let's go home, guys! And they get back on the rail car, and 3 of them are passed out, and 3 of them are still awake, and one of them's pushing, and they're going up. They're not even thinking about a train coming up. Well, lo and behold, they do collide with a train under full headway, collides into this handcar with these 6 drunk Irishmen, and 2 of them had to be extricated from the cowcatcher. Oh! And this is what the cowcatcher looked like, not with the men still in it. So just sort of Veg-O-Matic, these 6 Irishmen in April of 1855. So that's a good story just to tell before lunch. So two of them had the sense to jump off. The other 2, or one of them jumped off. 3 of them just blown many yards away and were badly injured, but 2 of them were killed. So anyway. As what this one quote said, the Illinois Central Railroad ended forever the usefulness of the stagecoach in Lee County and in Ogle County and in Whiteside and Joe Davies and Carroll, etc. All over the area, the stagecoach stops. There may be a couple more months where it's going on, taking people here or there, but it pretty much ends, and the stagecoach era essentially comes to an end in 1855. And so what I've covered really is this stagecoach era from 1828 to 1855, and I don't think anybody has covered that. It's my knowledge it doesn't exist until I wrote what I did. And then after that, studying newspaper columns after 1855, and trying to find references to the stagecoach. And it's amazingly absent. But about 30 years later, you start to see a couple articles talk about the good old stagecoach. 30 years before they were cursing it as this cursed stagecoach. Because when you're in these things, you're bouncing around like this. You're knee to knee and shoulder to shoulder with other people, all crammed into this space. You're going 4.5 miles an hour, which is about, that's 4.5 miles an hour. Yeah, you can walk faster, or just as fast than you can in a stagecoach. But they go slow to make the horses last as long as you can. But it's miserable travel. And it's colliding with rocks and ruts and mud puddles and getting tipped over on this, that, and the other thing, and people are getting injured. It's miserable. So the question is, what was lost? And then several years later, you find a couple of writers in the newspapers longing for the good old days when the stagecoach was around, and I ran into this quote, which was in the Dixon Evening Telegraph in February of 1888. In the days of the blessed old stagecoach, the passengers could not ride together and be jolted against each other and tossed from side to side without getting acquainted. By contrast, he said, one can travel in comfort by rail in seclusion and in a parlor car and still be depressed and lonely. Well, such is the progress of conveniences and the railroad. But as a general rule, everybody loved the railroad and what it brought. So that's the end of my presentation. But if you do want a free PDF of this thing, I'm just giving away my book for free. All my stuff is footnoted. So if you want to check out the sources of all these allegations I'm making, it's all there in the thing. Just write down my email address or give me your business card or something, and I'd be glad to send it to you here after we get out of here. I went way longer than necessary. I hope this was enjoyable to you.